So thank you again to Carol for the invitation to present this evening and to all of you for spending some time with me tonight. I'm delighted to speak with you this evening about my new book, Modern Mobility Aloft, Elevated Highways, Architecture, and Urban Change in Pre-Interstate America. The book unpacks a very specific set of car-centric landscapes in Chicago, New York, and Boston. It profiles, as Carol mentioned, Wacker Drive in Chicago, which still stands, the West Side Elevated Highway that preceded the current West Side Highway in Manhattan, and the Central Artery, Boston's elevated highway that was ultimately replaced by the tunneled highway and network of public parks of the infamous Big Dig. These three constructed roads are all locally famous or infamous, as the case may be. They met different fates in the last quarter century, and they presented vastly different visual appearances. And yet, together, I argue that they narrate a critical period of change for American cities in the first half of the 20th century, when the impact of automobility came to bear on the physical fabric and economic vitality of existing urban centers. One especially strong piece of evidence of this shift in New York comes via a New York Times headline that you see on the screen here that documents an automobile race that happened 84 years ago today. And I can't believe the synchronicity that made that line up with today, February 9th, 1937. On this date, there was an automobile race in Manhattan between two unlikely contestants, Manhattan Borough President Samuel Levy and New York Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia. These two leaders competed in a good-humored automobile race to celebrate the completion of the last leg of the West Side Elevated Highway, which now empowered uninterrupted north-south movement along New York's West Side between Canal Street and 72nd Street. Borough President Levy used existing city streets to travel between City Hall and West 50th Street, while the mayor cruised the new elevated highway to make the same trip, finishing over 20 minutes before his rival. This victory, a foregone conclusion, showcased the importance and excitement of efficient automobile movement in Manhattan. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with it, the West Side Elevated Highway was an Art Deco ornamented elevated expressway running down the middle of existing waterfront streets for more than 4 miles along Manhattan's Hudson River shore. It was built between 1929 and 1937, closed in 1973, and ultimately demolished and replaced with the current version of the West Side Highway in the 1990s. The idea for the West Side Elevated Highway developed in response to early 20th century congestion along the city's working waterfront, where railroads, freight trucks, and local street vehicles jockeyed to reach their destinations, thwarting movement for all. The conceptual idea for sorting and separating different street users via an elevated street emerged as early as 1908, but only once the local Manhattan borough president got behind the idea did the elevated highway scheme ever get real consideration, let alone final implementation. Its final form showcased sculptural decorations of winged wheels, gears, and geometric patterns, which celebrated the mechanized nature of Jazz Age New York. I'll also introduce you to this image, the literal downfall of the West Side Elevated Highway, a portion of which collapsed on December 15th, 1973, ironically under the weight of a loaded dump truck bringing asphalt to repair the deteriorating road. This accident provided the ultimate exclamation mark to the road's 36-year tenure, during which time automobile usage and speeds had expanded so much that its jagged path, narrow lanes, and physical presence had soured public experience of and sentiments toward the highway. This accident provoked reconsideration of automobile transportation along the West Side, first via the contentious and ultimately defeated proposal for the so-called Westway, and ultimately yielding the current on-grade version of the West Side Highway and flanking Hudson River Park. This process of major reevaluation and renovation in response to an elevated highway is actually how this project started for me, but not in New York, rather in Boston. I'd like to explain a bit about how I arrived at this topic, how I chose my 3 main examples, and then share some of what I found specific to New York. The seed for this project began for me back in the late 1990s and early 2000s when I was working at an architecture firm in downtown Boston and watched daily as the city endured tunneling, destruction, and construction, all in the name of the enormous Big Dig, the country's largest ever public works project that built a new 10-lane underground highway beneath a still functioning elevated highway, and then created a new ribbon of public parks in its place. Watching the hulking form of the elevated highway stand amidst this upheaval, and watching the city choose such an audacious approach to revising this landscape made me wonder, surely somebody thought that the original elevated highway was a good idea when it was originally built. Who thought this? And what was their original vision for it? This book began as a search to answer those questions in Boston, and then expanded to encompass related projects in different cities. I approached these highways as landscapes that encapsulated specific intentions about modern urban movement and modern architectural form at the scale of the entire city. And I wanted to discover who designed them, what problems they sought to solve, and how they intended viewers and users to engage with their finished forms. Research about Boston's situation revealed concerns about urban congestion, economic stagnation, and utopian-inspired solutions that ultimately reverberated in the New York and Chicago cases. The concept of an elevated crosstown road for Boston originated in the 1920s, prompted by concerns about the city's economic and physical modernity in the face of increasing competition from other cities, and the sense that Boston needed to do something major to smooth local traffic congestion and increase downtown access. Thanks to a New York-based planning consultant who advocated for and designed the elevated highway scheme in the late 1920s, Boston officially proposed this idea in 1930. However, the Depression and then World War II delayed implementation of this project until the state of Massachusetts incorporated the design into a regional transportation improvement plan in 1948, which secured its ultimate implementation between 1951 and 1959. Laced between and through the city's existing modest masonry fabric and requiring demolition of many buildings along its path, the central artery's mechanized forms and disruptive posture provided visual evidence of the city's modern intentions. Its superstructure offered exposed I-beams, horizontally banded guardrails, and tubular steel railings that manifested a mix of engineering utility and mid-century streamlined simplicity. The hulking physicality of the highway, 30 to 40 feet high and ranging from 100 to 200 feet across, interrupted streets and created new visual and auditory disruptions, signaling a major experiential and architectural realignment for Boston's waterfront corridor. It was these environmental disruptions, paired with the road's inadequate traffic capacity relative to burgeoning automobile usage over the next 40 years, that eventually compelled its replacement with the Big Dig. With the central artery as my starting point, I investigated two other elevated highways that matched three major criteria established in Boston. First, I was interested in roads that had been inserted into older urban landscapes where early automobile use overwhelmed existing streets and provoked quick calls for major interventions. Second, there needed to be a current local presence and dialogue with the elevated highway, meaning it could still be in use, recently revised, or recently removed, all of which demonstrated the ongoing relevance of potential subjects. And finally, the roads needed to predate the Interstate Highway Act of 1956, meaning that they emerged as local projects solving local problems and were not bound to nationally mandated standards for route or design. This led me to add to my study the West Side Elevated Highway, as you know, and Wacker Drive in Chicago, built 1924 to 1926 and still in use today. In addition to fitting my tripartite criteria, these roads offer different visual vocabularies than the central artery, Art Deco in New York and classically inspired in Chicago, which amplified the role of architectural intention in the lives of these designs. The earliest of my roads trio is Chicago's Wacker Drive, completed in 1926 and which remains intact and in use today. It offers two levels of movement along the southern shore of the Chicago River that are visible only from the river and points north, since the surrounding streets rise to connect to Wacker Drive's top level, obscuring its constructed nature. Along the river, Wacker Drive offers a Beaux-Arts facade of rusticated arches, railings, pedestrian walkways, and lampposts, while from the south it's completely invisible. This scheme emerged from what feels like an unlikely source relative to modern architecture and urbanism, City Beautiful architects and planners Daniel Burnham and Edward Bennett. Burnham and Bennett proposed what would become Wacker Drive as part of their famed 1909 Plan of Chicago, a city plan that aimed to systematize movement and architectural forms in the city according to classically inspired principles of procession, organization, and architectural form. Born in the pre-automotive age, Wacker Drive endures as a backbone of automotive movement in Chicago and has benefited from restoration and updates geared toward both its automotive and pedestrian audiences. With the context of these three examples, we will focus on New York's evolution as pertains to three main categories: its relationship to pre-automotive transportation in the area, its visual and functional connections to avant-garde discourse in design and science fiction publications, and its extensive decorative program. First, the seemingly modern idea of an elevated highway for New York was actually rooted in decades-long frustrations about the inefficiencies and dangers of uncoordinated multimodal transportation. Since the late 19th century, most discussion about the Hudson River waterfront centered on accommodating railroad and shipping interests, not those of automobile users. As many of you well know, Manhattan's western shore served as a major port on the Atlantic coast and also welcomed intracontinental deliveries from New Jersey and northern points along the Hudson River. However, the port's piers were too small to accommodate too many large ships, and the disconnect between railroad lines terminating in New Jersey and ocean shipping facilities on the Hudson shore meant that both boats continuously shuttled back and forth between the shores. Moreover, a local monopoly over Manhattan railroads limited efficient transfers of goods and posed a real danger to local streetgoers. This danger was most evident south of 60th Street, where the island's single steam freight railroad ran on a series of west side surface streets until its terminus at Canal Street. Accidents between steam engines and street users became increasingly frequent, and I should say increasingly gory, and sparked a lot of outrage from the community. As time went on, the growing popularity of automobiles and motor trucks only compounded the area's hazards. These conditions compelled proposals for vertical traffic separations that aimed to sort different types of users and traffic via street overpasses, train tunnels, or elevated railroads. And as you can see, some on the screen date back actually even earlier than the moment I'm talking about. These two on the screen are from 1908. In 1911, the New York Central Railroad merged two of these approaches in their proposal for an elevated roadway atop a new elevated freight railroad along the west side. This idea lingered in various planning discussions for the next 13 years, but the city and the railroad failed to reach agreement about jointly implementing this or any other scheme. However, Borough President Miller latched onto the idea of a standalone elevated highway along the west side as a fragment of this plan and made it his personal crusade to advance the project. Meanwhile, during this same time period, architects, engineers, planners, artists, and sci-fi enthusiasts filled the pages of design magazines and newspapers with utopian ideas about ways to remedy urban congestion and build cities of the future. A recurring theme in these paper schemes targeted street congestion by separating different users into stacked horizontal planes of movement. Versions of this approach even predated the automobile, including the construction of what you see here on the screen. This was a short-lived cast iron pedestrian bridge built across Broadway in 1866 called the Low Bridge, and it only survived for about 3 years before complaints about its shadows and its aesthetics compelled its removal. Other incarnations magnified the basic engineering mentality of elevated railroads by projecting multiple levels of railroads and streets weaving across cities. More dynamic versions of these schemes suggested that elevated planes of movement could activate urban spaces in new ways. This came via proposals for hanging sidewalks off the second stories of buildings, laying roads on building roofs, constructing networks of blimps and airplane stations atop skyscrapers, and designing entirely new urban landscapes based on elevated streets, walkways, and skyscrapers as their main building blocks. And I should mention that the book actually dedicates an entire chapter to unpacking this typology of kind of utopian thinking. Some of the most detailed and widely publicized schemes came from architects Le Corbusier, Hugh Ferris, and Harvey Wiley Corbett, who I'm sure are familiar to many of you here tonight. Le Corbusier, as many of you likely know, dreamed of replacing the confusion of 19th century cities with equally dense but rigorously organized new urban patterns that he explored in a successive number of ideal plans throughout the 1920s and 30s. Transportation was the lifeblood of his plans, where he envisioned 3 different levels of specialized roads to accommodate distinct types of traffic and planned a huge intermodal transportation terminal at the center of his cities. Meanwhile, New York-based architects Hugh Ferris and Harvey Wiley Corbett cultivated paper and real schemes for using commercial skyscrapers to maximize space and profits within the volumetric confines dictated by the city's famed 1916 zoning ordinance. They showcased these ideas in a series of drawings, exhibits, and publications, which, in addition to projecting cities regularly punctuated by similar skyscrapers, featured multi-tiered transportation networks laced between and through buildings. All of these proposals, and others like them, cast urban futures in terms of technological empowerment via taller buildings and faster and more efficient movement. This meant that as New York leaders wrestled with trying to improve West Side transportation, this dialogue primed the public for seeing elevated highways as progressive models for transportation, architecture, and urban form. These schemes notwithstanding, the reality of inserting an elevated highway into New York's West Side proved more complex than this utopian backdrop promised. Between 1926 and 1929, the planning and debate about the proposed highway scheme alternated between celebrating its bare engineered utility and lamenting its potential physical disruption that it would bring to the area. A city engineer designed the first incarnation of the highway scheme, which you see here on the bottom of the screen, which was to be 65 feet wide and sit 20 feet above city streets. Its cement-clad steel frame was to host 3 lanes of traffic in each direction, and the design anticipated the eventual addition of a second deck on top to isolate north and southbound traffic on dedicated levels. All told, this design evoked aspects of existing elevated railroads. It also would run mostly down the middle of existing streets, which did not require the property seizures necessitated in Chicago and Boston, but which too easily conjured memories of elevated railroads yet again. On the one hand, Borough President Miller's initial 1926 proposal met with great enthusiasm from officials and merchants alike, who celebrated the improved safety, traffic capacity, and economic prospects that his plan promised. That said, objections mounted quickly about its lack of coordination with comprehensive planning for the West Side, its potential for obstructing ground level streets, and its aesthetic likenesses to the aforementioned elevated railroads that had only been recently removed from many New York streets. This set of objections ensnared the project in various debates throughout 1928 and 1929. While eventually there was some progress in resolving broader West Side planning issues, there was lingering public concern about the highway's physical and aesthetic presence in city streets that kept it from full approval. Architectural design, however, became the antidote to these complaints. Even as Miller secured official approval for the elevated highway scheme in January 1929, community groups successfully lobbied the city to hire architects to refine the project's forms. The city subsequently retained architects John Sloan and T. Marco Robertson, a Manhattan architectural duo who had recently completed a series of widely acclaimed Art Deco skyscrapers in the city. These buildings, including the French, Gray Bar, and Shannon buildings, exemplified the architectural tenor of the moment, with step-back profiles distinguished by stylized decorations at their street and crown levels. At the Shannon building, Sloan and Robertson worked with noted architectural sculptor René Chambellan to create an extensive sculptural program for the building's first 4 floors, something still easily visible today if you're in the vicinity of Grand Central Station. Sloan and Robertson translated their general skyscraper approach to apply to the planned expressway, even going so far as to hire Chambellan to develop a decorative vocabulary to mediate between the highway and its surroundings. Their resulting designs offered distinct visual experiences for the different sets of people affected by the highway, and notably embraced mechanized iconography to express the excitement of burgeoning automobile movement. We see this in the series of sculptural relief panels that they designed to hang on the highway superstructure that would mark street intersections and announce pier locations. And you can see one of those drawings on the bottom of the screen here. These reliefs integrated winged allusions to eagles with abstracted wheel and gear forms, Art Deco geometries, and modern typography to make the landscape literally legible to those moving around it at ground level. Those driving on the road were to be greeted by granite entrance ramps featuring imagery of wings and wheels that foreshadowed the forthcoming speed and thrill of highway movement. With this extensive decorative program in play, Miller's highway project received full approval to proceed. Construction proceeded in a piecemeal fashion, however, stretching for a long time between May 1929 and February 1937, and with its completion, I should say, celebrated by the automobile race that I outlined at the start of my comments tonight. But despite its hard-fought decorative program, the West Side Elevated Highway manifested its most potent impacts in ways unrelated to its sculptural relief. The highway offered 2 30-foot wide roadways threaded 25 feet in the air for 4.5 miles along the Hudson River shore. Its awesome scale and dominant location in the middle of the street overpowered adjoining pier buildings, commercial structures, pedestrians, and vehicles alike. Its long approach ramps limited space and visibility beneath the highway, and noise and pollution from ever greater amounts of traffic above discouraged movement beneath or around its steel underpinnings. From the automotive perspective, the highway became a popular north-south route in Manhattan, and the experience of driving on the road's elevated perch was a thrilling, if not also sometimes jostling, experience. Over time, though, its route, form, and width proved troublesome for evolving volumes, speeds, and sizes of vehicles, and de-icing salts also began to corrode the roadbed. While the city promised large-scale rehabilitation throughout the 1950s and 60s, they failed to act before the highway's deteriorating condition forced their proverbial hand with the 1973 road collapse that I mentioned earlier. After the collapse, the city closed major sections of the road while it evaluated next steps, and they eventually chose to demolish the elevated highway in the 1990s and replace it with the on-grade roadway that we have today south of 57th Street. This new kind of quote unquote urban boulevard, as they build it, is the current West Side Highway, still focused on automobility, but no longer bound by the looming physical presence of its elevated predecessor. New York's experience outlines a tripart pattern in the lifespan and impacts of these elevated highways. First, there were jarring disconnects between the local traffic concerns that originally sparked the projects and the people using and impacted by the highway projects as actually implemented. In Chicago, this was visible in the different groups of people who originally proposed the plan for what became Wacker Drive and those displaced to make actual room for it. Its design originated thanks to a business advocacy group called the Commercial Club, who sought to use city planning as a way to stimulate economic and physical improvements to the city, and of course, thereby improving their business prospects by extension. In this case, their target was the industrial working Chicago riverfront, which then hosted the chaotic and congested epicenter of Chicago's food chain, the South Water Street Market. Project proponents lamented the area's existing decrepit conditions, related traffic congestion, and resulting economic costs, to area business owners. And I should say they even tried to quantify this about how much the delays in this area would cost local business owners. In contrast, Chicago's planners proposed to claim the market land and transform it into a new double-deck road fronting a slew of new commercial skyscrapers. The two-level road was to separate commercial traffic, thereby reducing intersections, facilitating easier freight deliveries, and speeding movement from both constituencies. The architects planned to cloak this entire new riverfront in classically inspired grandeur by lacing the road with rusticated arcades, balustrade-lined pedestrian walkways, and grand light fixtures at major intersections. Project advocates marketed the concept using juxtaposed images of existing conditions with photo montage renderings of the proposed riverfront. And I'll break my frame for a second to mention that this is a 1922 version of Photoshop, if you will, where they actually pasted on top imagery of their would-be buildings here on top of a photograph that aligns with the real photographic view that you see here on the left. Excuse me, the heavy-hitting commercial business advocates who are setting up this type of propaganda were no match for the market vendors who were upset about being displaced here. And so, of course, this project ultimately proceeded, yielding a new urban landscape that was much more comprehensive than that which actually materialized ever in Boston or New York. But Wacker Drive came to fruition via the displacement of citizens, buildings, and market businesses that were deemed less desirable than those of the commercial advocates who initiated the entire city plan. This set an ominous precedent for many later incarnations of highway and urban improvement projects, including Boston in particular. In New York, because of the highway's posture in the middle of existing streets, displacement was less of an issue than the shock of the road's overwhelming scale, which changed the tenor of street-level interactions and brought a much broader automotive audience to the streets of the West Side. The second big pattern that I discovered was that even as elevated highways were touted as essential parts of utopian systems for new urban forms, when implemented in isolation, they announced the negative aspects of modern technological change more glaringly than its benefits. This was especially the case in Boston, where the 1930 proposal for the Central Artery projected the highway running down a corridor of buildings offering vaguely modern forms, with some silhouettes evoking contemporary Art Deco geometries. But notably, this corridor had no resemblance to any existing landscape in Boston, and the realization of the Central Artery did not yield any such cityscape as a result. Rather, the Central Artery's finished form dramatically contrasted with the modest urban fabric that surrounded it in both intentional and shocking ways. The Central Artery's roadbed paralleled the second and third floors of adjoining buildings, and its wide stance cast dark shadows on adjoining streets. In some places, the highway's path sliced through existing buildings. In others, the road's green form served as the dominant site at the end of local streets. Parts of these impacts match the mechanized utopian visions of the designers who first proposed the Central Artery design. Other aspects, however, amplified the role of these projects in announcing the brash arrival of modern forms that denigrated adjoining properties by proximity. This applied in most sinister form in Boston's North End, where the Central Artery's path cut across the neighborhood's mixed-use buildings in busy streets, requiring the demolition of swaths of homes and businesses and creating awkward adjacencies throughout. Therefore, at least in the case of Boston and New York, we can think of these elevated highways as utopian architectural fragments, born of exciting architectural and transportation intentions, but fraught with more complicated and contradictory impacts on existing landscapes. And finally, relative to the early date of these three projects, automobile usage expanded at such an unexpectedly rapid pace that the highway's predicted capacities and lifespans quickly shrank, spurring successive highway expansions in each city. In New York, we already addressed how the West Side Elevated Highway literally deteriorated and buckled under surging traffic volumes and speeds, compelling its replacement by the current West Side Highway. In Boston, where the Central Artery scheme sat awaiting implementation for 20 years, Automotive usage, size, and speeds steadily increased, even as the highway's design capacity remained constant. This mismatch became glaringly obvious just the day after the central artery opened in 1959, when 114,000 vehicles traversed a road predicted to carry 90,000 vehicles per day. And I promise you, it only got worse after that. Within a short time, lay people, architects, and architectural critics seemed to agree that the central artery had created a new host of urban problems. By the 1970s, attention increasingly focused on the idea of putting the central artery underground and reclaiming its former path as viable land for the city. The result is today's Rose Kennedy Greenway, a 1.5-mile linear park that sits in the former highway corridor, topping a 10-lane underground version of the central artery. Wacker Drive, in some ways, offers the most confusingly successful example of my three, yielding both its physical expansion and its general disregard as a work of architecture. Wacker Drive's origin and implementation within a comprehensive plan for the city of Chicago provided a more unified level of aesthetic and functional alignment than that ever achieved in New York or Boston, even as that success came at the expense of displacing people and businesses who occupied the riverfront beforehand. The recasting of the riverfront, combined with a general surge of automobile use in the 1930s and 40s, compelled the extension of Wacker Drive, first south in the 1940s and 50s, and then east to Lakeshore Drive in the 1970s. Neither of these extensions continued the road's original architectural vocabulary. In the years since, however, there has been renewed investment in the original section of Wacker Drive. The city reduced the width of structural supports to make room for more cars and expanded its pedestrian accessibility along the water to create the recently renamed Chicago Riverwalk. This means that Wacker Drive endures today not only as a critical thoroughfare for automotive movement along the Chicago River, but also as an armature for pedestrian movement and visual panache. So, considering the design processes of all three roads together then, my book asserts that early elevated highways brought automotive and architectural modernity to bear on American cities in ways more powerful than single buildings and in manners that have been overly simplified or ignored. These projects were designed and constructed with architectural intentions about modernization of urban space. Designers sometimes aspired to civic improvement via destruction and displacement. Other times they envisioned engineered efficiency, and still others, they used aesthetic interventions to strike a balance between these extremes. However, the glaring differences between the new highways and their contexts, as well as their long-time inadequacies in handling modern traffic burdens, have overshadowed thinking about them as designed landscapes born of aspirational intentions. As we confront the increasingly dire effects of climate change, due in no small part to our society's automobile dependence, understanding the history of these early roads allows us to more clearly see where we have been and to chart a path for where we would like to go. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Amy. That was really a lot of fun to see all those slides, especially of New York and the Art Deco aspirations for the West Side Highway, the much detested West Side Highway. I must say, I remember it myself, parts of it. Well, there's so many topics that we could discuss, and I will encourage our audience to pose questions in the chat box, which I will then, once I see that there are some, go off camera and try to read and incorporate into the discussion. But just to get us started, I'll mention, because I mentioned it to you, a talk about Westway, not the West Side Highway, but the replacement for
Yes.
the West Side Highway, that a scholar, Bill Busby, wrote a book, Fighting Westway, a few years ago, and gave a talk at the museum, which I will promote to our audience because you can go and listen to his video, about an hour lecture, where he described the various, and he's a professor of law, and so took some of the issues about environmental law and the various coalitions and politics and politicians that came together in order to try to find an alternative to the West Side Highway that was Westway, but failed. And it's a very fascinating study, and the kind of unpacking of the issues that he presents in the book and in the talk seem to me parallel but different from
Right.
your city fathers of the 19 teens and the 1920s, and even into LaGuardia and that pre-interstate era, as you describe it. Now we're so accustomed in New York to think about Moses, before
Right.
Moses, after Moses, and a post-Moses era in terms of urban renewal. But I know from some of the recent research that I've done on 6th Avenue and 7th Avenue, so the southern extension of 7th Avenue back in the 19 teens when the subway went through, and then we plowed through the village in order to create an at-grade 6-lane highway, in effect, an avenue that didn't exist. And the same thing happened in the 20s through Greenwich Village in order to extend Church or connect Church Street to 6th Avenue.
Right.
And that was because the Holland Tunnel was being finished and connecting to this amazing kind of nexus of infrastructure that went across Canal Street. It seems to me that in the models that you present, that Chicago is different than New York and Boston, because New York and Boston were above ground and Chicago is actually subgrade. And to connect that to the failure of Westway and the various coalitions that did not succeed in getting the federal dollars in order to support 90% of the development cost of a subgrade highway with a park and development on it, it seems to me that the trajectory of history is towards putting things underground, as you show in Boston, as failed in New York, but as succeeded in the model established by Chicago back in kind of the City Beautiful progressive era vision.
Well, that's a great interweaving of all those different examples, Carol. I think the one important qualifier about Chicago, and I actually addressed this in the opening chapter of the book a little bit, is that I think Chicago is easy to misunderstand as actually subterranean because it reads that way to us today. What's fascinating about it is during the buildup, I suppose pun intended, to Wacker Drive's construction and when it's being planned, there was new federal legislation that was being mandated about the height of bridges across the Chicago River and about the approaches to those bridges. And Chicago was facing the prospect of having to replace all of the different bridges across the Chicago River, and they're contemplating doing this new, what they call the South Water Street improvement before it becomes Wacker Drive. And they realized that the way to kind of ensure the project's completion and to smooth how much money and labor and investment they're putting in is to fuse the two together. And so they actually raised the entire ground plane of the area south of the Chicago River, such that the top of Wacker Drive, as we see it today, feels like the ground plane kind of naturally occurring, but it's actually not. And the way they plan and literally recast that whole area of the city allows us to understand it that way today. To me, what I think becomes interesting about Chicago as a precedent is the fact that Wacker Drive and Michigan Avenue and other areas close to the river were integrated kind of according to a vision for that whole area that was more comprehensive, as opposed to these individual projects that are kind of solving one problem without really considering the larger urban scheme and how they're going to connect together. And I think that's certainly what you're referencing in New York is as they're building this kind of network of infrastructure, right? There starts to be, how are we going to go over this or under this to make these things connect? And I think that becomes a kind of a reactive approach, if you will, to kind of very specific needs, as opposed to a proactive view of the entire thing, which arguably, I think the Central Artery and the West Side Highway, probably from their designers' perspectives, they would have loved to have been able to design a whole new urban landscape, but that was not the task at hand. So I think Chicago colors or clouds that a little bit in the way we understand it today, but understanding it maybe, as I use in the book, the term the constructed roadway helps maybe buffer that a little bit.
Hmm. There are some questions which I'm going to turn my camera off so that I can read properly. But in the meantime, in order to keep you busy, I will ask you, how did the three cities pay for these infrastructure improvements? Was it in the same way? And what were the mechanisms for that? Can you explain?
Absolutely. Great question. So a lot of it had to do with tax assessments in all three cases. That was very much the case in Chicago, where they actually spend years in court trying to quantify, how far away somebody should be from the location of Wacker Drive, or excuse me, the South Water Street improvement originally, to bear any tax burden for having an extra assessment. And so they go through lots of legal wrangling trying to figure that out. But they ultimately do, and they proceed. In New York, it comes, and I should say this is one of the themes, is thinking about these projects actually as locally sourced and beginning fueled locally. In New York, it comes through the city's office. I believe they float a couple of bonds. I'm not remembering all the details of exactly the financing mechanism, but it's local money coming through the mayor's office, and I should say, and through the borough president of Manhattan's office, who of course initiates the whole thing. In Boston, it's a little bit more convoluted because, as I suggested, this project begins as a city project, and as time goes on over the course of its delay, its purview changes, and so it gets kind of swallowed up by larger plans. So in 1948, it's integrated into a Massachusetts state regional transportation plan, which ensures some state monies. And it's actually city and state coffers that fund the initial construction. And after the 1956 Highway Act is passed, the project is already partially under construction, but not fully there. Then there are some federal dollars that kick in, and they kind of rebrand it as I-93 and connect it through to the interstate system, but it doesn't originate with those dollars in mind. And that's why it actually worked so well as kind of the end point of this trio, if you will, that it speaks to that transition and to what I suggest is the homogenization of kind of federal mandates about road design that followed the 1956 Act.
Interesting. I think I'll stay off camera so I can read these more easily for you, but Owen Goodfriend is asking, unlike the other two, the central artery wasn't along a waterfront. It didn't follow existing rights of way. It seems like they chose a path of maximum disruption
Right.
and maximum destruction. Was there an alternative approach considered at the time?
Great question, Owen, and thank you so much for the question and for coming tonight. So you're absolutely right. It's a little bit of both and here. The initial segment, and I didn't bring images of this tonight, but the initial segment of the Central Artery does follow part of the existing Atlantic Avenue in Boston for some of its length. But then it kind of makes a left turn, if you will, and there took a direct path across existing fabric. And it was heavily contested. There's actually a whole effort of local residents in the North End who, once they realize that the neighborhood is really going to be cut in half because of this, they create a poster campaign where they hang posters on buildings that say, please know this building is slated to be torn down for the elevated highway. If you think this is a bad thing, come to the meeting Tuesday at 7 and stuff like that. They also explore an alternate route, which would have taken the Central Artery effectively around the water side of the North End, so kind of keeping it more waterfront bound, if you will, or water bound. And I think that they even rationalized that would have saved some money, but it really becomes about expediency of connection. And so those in power ultimately choose the more direct connection instead of the one that would have saved some of those businesses and buildings in the way. And I think that's certainly not accidental. I think they also really had the idea of reframing the city in a pretty dramatic way. And that's ultimately what they got. Though certainly people are not thrilled about that who are affected. Thank you for the question.
There's another question from Alan, who is particularly interested in the precedent of the railroads, the elevated railroads, and he's says that he's curious about the role of the rail infrastructure in setting the stage for elevated highways, in particular the Park Avenue Rail Viaduct in Manhattan that predated the automobile. And of course, other elevated and steam railways.
Sure.
Most of those facilities were relatively utilitarian and very unpleasant, yet people had to accept them and live with them. Would elevated highways ever have been considered or accepted in cities without having had that precedent?
That's a great question. Thank you for that. So elevated railways are a key piece of this conversation in terms of a precedent, because on the one hand, they demonstrate this kind of maybe straight and narrow kind of view of engineered simplicity, of we're going to sort and separate the different types of travel. And so there's a clear precedent for saying, well, look, we've done that before and we put the railroads above. But there's kind of this willing suspension of disbelief of understanding certain bits of the pluses and minuses of elevated railroads that comes with this, that even as these cities are talking about it, there are letters to the editor in the local paper saying, well, this is a bad idea. And how do you think this is any different from the elevated railway over there? Part of what answers those concerns is this kind of faith in technological progress. There's conversations about we're going to use certain types of paving and certain types of rubber that are going to keep traffic on the elevated highway totally silent. There's a similar faith that kind of goes on with elevated railways for a little while, of thinking that maybe if they had a different motive power, not steam, that they could be quieter and therefore more tolerable. There's also even exploration of, could we repurpose elevated railroad infrastructure, the actual superstructure of the whole thing, and put a road on top? And they actually talk about that a little bit in Boston in particular, because for part of the Central Arteries path, there was an existing elevated railroad that ran along Atlantic Avenue. Clearly that doesn't come to pass. They realize that it's not cost effective to be able to bump up the structure to support automotive traffic in that regard. But the elevated railways here are kind of a strange precedent in that they arguably empower a very similar approach to managing different types of movement. And yet there is this kind of willingness to set aside the unpleasantness of those elevated railroad precedents to embrace the automobile as this lifeblood for the future. And I should say, maybe it's not just the automobile, but even just embrace this new sphere and pace of movement, because as we noted, that many of these roads really predate widespread automobility, but they certainly are coming alive as cars are really expanding in their popularity. Thank you for that.
And we have a question from Alex Garvin, and I want we may need a little bit more amplification from Alex, who maybe will type it in. But he writes, Westway and the alternative not built in Boston were much more ambitious. Not sure ambitious than what? Why did nothing that complex get built in either of those cases?
Well, maybe Carol, you're right that maybe Alice could tell us a little more what you mean by ambitious. I mean, my read of what I think maybe you mean is the sense that these were projects that attempted to do more than just bury the road, as the case may be. And that's one of the complicated legacies, certainly of the Central Artery of the Big Dig in Boston, is that we now have a wider, bigger highway that goes underneath the city. And the Rose Kennedy Greenway is certainly a much better experience on the surface. But the flip side is it doesn't really address the basic fundamental question of what should the role of automobile transportation in a city be. It kind of literally and metaphorically buries the problem. And of course, over the long debates leading up to the Big Dig, there was discussion about having a rail link and public transportation that would be part of the Big Dig, and that would finally unite South Station and North Station in Boston, the two main rail stations, which for 150 years have never had a connection between them, and they still do not. And those things are ultimately sidelined, and they don't do it. And so I think there are different reasons for both. I think in Boston, it's partially financial. In New York, as Carol mentioned, the Westway is a very complicated scenario for its environmental impacts, aside from lots of the other legal pieces of its relationship to the interstate highway funding that would have theoretically empowered part of it. So I'm not sure I can speak to that one as comfortably, but I think that in Boston, we achieved pieces of a more comprehensive vision with the idea of the Greenway. I think the challenge, though, is that the Greenway doesn't knit the wound in the city back together. And so as lovely as the parks are, it doesn't fundamentally question the fact that we have a gash in the city that has never been healed.
Mm. I think I remember reading on your bio that you were an advisor to that project. Could you speak maybe a little bit to in this different era than we're in from your original projects, the citizen participation or the public engagement in the project? Was that a part of your mandate?
In terms of, so just to clarify, so my role was actually more recent. I served as a consulting historian for them about 2 years ago. And the Greenway has launched a wonderful public art program that is ongoing throughout the year in the Greenway, but also commissions new works of art every year. And so in 2018 to 2019, and actually went a little longer because they made it digital going into the pandemic, they launched a series of augmented reality installations on the Greenway. And I served as the consulting historian in that we had 10 different locations along the Greenway that were geotagged to an app that folks could use on their phone, where you could line up where you were standing in the Greenway with a view of that same spot in a different moment in history. And so it became a way of telling the story of that landscape in real space, but using historical photographs that we could bring to the table. So it was a really exciting way of doing public history.
And one more question on the Big Dig from the audience. Did the completion of the Big Dig have a dramatic effect on the property values or property development in the center city? This is a question near and dear to my heart.
Right. Well, you hit the nail right on the head. I mean, this plugs into all kinds of current conversations about gentrification and cities being livable for people of lots of different socioeconomic backgrounds. And so absolutely, the Big Dig and the Greenway has now spawned a whole host of new investment in the corridor along the central artery or along the Greenway itself. And these spaces have become very, very gentrified. They're very expensive, really hard to afford for lots of folks. The flip side is there is a public, the fact that these parks are public, this is an area of the city that for a long time folks didn't go to on a regular basis. And so it has really reactivated this part of the city in a very exciting way. But I think that comes with an important awareness that we need to have about the rising property values and gentrification that goes with it. And it's now a very expensive park to live near.
Mm-hmm. So we only have a couple of minutes left. There were a number of chat questions which I can forward to you as well in case you want to answer, and people can I hope that you already know, our audience, that you will be able to see within about 2 days this video posted on our website, as well as other related content which will come up when you query this video. I think the natural question, and one of the questions in the chat, looks towards the future, and looks beyond the American landscape, which is a changing historical agenda, I think, with the relationship to the car. But if you have been to Shanghai or any Chinese city within the last 10 years or so, the solution to the traffic problem is, of course, the flyover or the 6 or 8 lane highway that's plowing above the city and through the space, rather than necessarily through an existing urban fabric, but over one that was previously low rise, and then the skyscrapers fill around on either side. So it does seem that that history keeps repeating itself decades later, which is in a demonstration of a kind of natural urban evolution as we adapt to different technologies, from the train to the car, and now one hopes in New York away from the car again and back towards the pedestrian space. Well, maybe if you haven't been to those Chinese cities, maybe you need to write up a grant proposal so that you can go and experience
I think
that,
so, yeah.
Make those connections across time. But one certainly sees in the amount of concrete and asphalt and the flyovers and the cloverleafs and the interchanges, a kind of brave new world that American cities experienced as they bravely tried to go into the future, and sometimes with accommodations that we could describe as modernity, but that seemed to be taking us back from livable cities. So that kind of tension between the proverbial Moses versus Jacob's tension
Right.
about what constitutes a good city and a future city is experiencing many phases of its development and changes over time. So we'll set you on that as your next project.
That's my homework. That sounds fantastic. That
Well,
sounds
we thank you very much for a really entertaining and a thought-provoking talk. I hope everybody comes back to talk about public space next month with Mariana Moglovich and to talk about New York in the 1960s. So we'll move the history forward. So thanks everybody tonight, and thanks again, Amy. It was really a great pleasure. Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much, Carol, and all of you. Thanks so much.
Hello, welcome everybody. It's 6 o'clock and I'm delighted to have you join us for one of our monthly book talks. The Skyscraper Museum has now for many years been welcoming an author to speak about a recent publication on the history of one of many topics, on the history of New York, the history of modernism, of modern cities, of course, skyscrapers, of urbanism generally, both American and international. So it's a great pleasure for this coming season to be able to feature some books that focus on modern American. And as I'm welcoming you tonight and promoting our next talks, I want to show you a couple of slides in order to whet your appetite for the months that come. And then I'll introduce our speaker for this evening, who's Amy Finstein. As you see, her book tonight, Modern Mobility Aloft, on elevated highways, architecture, and urban change in the Pre-Interstate America, is going to focus on a kind of urban landscape that we're very familiar with in New York, as well as in the two other cities that she particularly features in Chicago and in Boston, which is her own kind of urban orbit. Let me mention the two New York topics that are coming up in the next months, and show you the slides, which are pages from our website where you can make a reservation, as you can see in this particular slide, for these upcoming talks. So next month, in March, on March 10th, we have Mariana Moglovich, who is an architectural and urban historian who was trained at the GSD, I believe. I'm forgetting right now her particular bio, but she has written her dissertation on the Lindsay administration and the urban design initiatives that were done under that very creative and innovative administration. And as she looks at the invention of public space, a topic which is which we are so keenly aware of right now, she'll be talking about her recently released book, The Invention of Public Space and Designing for Inclusion in Lindsay's New York. And then we'll go back a little bit farther in time, but to that ever popular subject of Frank Lloyd Wright, in a book that Anthony Olofsson published last year, a well-known Wright scholar, focusing on Wright and New York City. So I'm sure that will be a popular topic, and each one of these books and talks will focus on New York as an urban, modern city, and the creation of modernity and the adaptation of modern life to urban space. So as we go back now to welcome you and introduce Amy Finstein, she will be sharing her screen in the moment that I get off. We'll share a screen together, and then she'll show you her very intriguing slides of both the planning and the downfall of some of the urban infrastructure that she has very creatively highlighted in a topic that has been her an expansion of her dissertation, which she did at the University of Virginia after studying fine arts and I guess in art history as an undergrad at Brandeis. So she now teaches as an assistant professor architecture and urban history and visual arts and environmental studies in the Department of Visual Arts at the College of Holy Cross in Worcester, Mass. She has published previously in a number of architectural and planning journals like the Journal of Planning History and Preservation Education and Research, in a range of other places. And she is a contributing author and an award of the award-winning Atlas of Boston History. And she is also serves on the board of the, I guess, the Northeast chapter, the Boston area chapter of the Society of Architectural Historians. So as someone who is steeped in both her research of the past and her ongoing research in architectural history and urban studies, she's a perfect fit for our series. So Amy, you want to turn your video on as I stop sharing my screen, and I'll let, there's Amy, welcome Amy. And she's now going to take over for a talk for about 35 minutes or so. Then we'll come back to have a bit of dialogue about the talk, but we are also inviting you to add your questions during the lecture to the chat box, and I will carefully record those and pose them when the talk is over. So I'm going to let Amy take over right now and disappear, and it's all yours, Amy.